All right, our very first lecture for public speaking. This is going to be our introduction to public speaking, chapter 1 of the textbook. We're going to have a quick overview of what today's lecture is going to consist of. We're going to look at what communication is and why is it that we study communication. We're going to also look at public speaking specifically and how public speaking is a process of communication. Now, as we get started, I like to include these little funny clips or videos. If you see anything that you'll think that you think is interesting and funny, and you'd like to share that with the class, email those to me, and who knows, it may wind up in our presentation. I hope you had a great weekend and are having a great week, hopefully better than this mother and her children here.
Hannah Collins, run in here, come get y'all juice.
Shit.
That was a bad idea, Mom. A very bad idea. Let's talk about what communication is. So communication is defined as a process, and it's a process meaning that it isn't spontaneous. We often think in regards to communication that sometimes we just communicate, but that simply isn't true. Anytime we communicate, both spoken or non-verbally, it's a process. We are thinking through, even if thinking through very quickly, we're thinking through what the message is that we're trying to send, how we want the receiver of that message to interpret our message, and what our next form of communication is going to be. So we do that very quickly without thinking. So communication is a process, and it's a process that isn't spontaneous. We put a lot of thought into how, when, and why we communicate. Communication also involves the use of symbols, and because of that, it has a constantly evolving knowledge base. Now, when we think about symbols, as anything around you. You're looking probably at a computer screen right now, either a laptop or a personal computer. That computer is a symbol. What does it symbolize? How do you know that that is a computer? Right? Why do we call it a computer and not a lamp? Right? Imagine that. We could be having this presentation today, watching this presentation on our lamp. Right? That just sounds weird, right? It's because we have come to define that a laptop or a computer is a particular item. So someone at some point in time in your life has told you, this is what a computer is. This is what a computer does. This is when you use a computer. These are the types of things you can do on a computer. So a computer symbolizes all of that. And as a result of new products and technologies being created, we have a constantly evolving knowledge base in regards to what symbols are and what they mean. And the third facet of communication is that communication involves a sharing or an exchange of meanings. And again, because it's an exchange of meaning, it requires an understanding that language changes, that language evolves, that it's constantly changing. So for instance, if you were to go to, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. If you were to go to Houston, Texas, and you were to say, konnichiwa, to someone on the street, chances are they probably are not going to know what you mean, right? That's Japanese for hello or how are you, or you could say ni hao ma in Mandarin or Chinese, and they're probably not going to understand what you mean either, right? But you could say hello or you could say hi, and they would understand because communication involves a sharing or exchange of meaning. Words only mean something to us if we have an understanding of what that particular language means. And so because our language is constantly evolving, our understanding of meaning and language evolves as well. For instance, when I was in college, if we went out, we'd say, oh, we're going to have a good time. And now you have different terminology, different things that go with that. Turnt, lit, those words did not exist when I was in college. If someone were to say to me when I was a senior in college 12, 13 years ago, hi Rick, oh my gosh, yeah, I got so lit last night, I would have no understanding, no idea what they meant by that, right? Because that didn't mean anything to me. That language didn't exist then. So because language continues to evolve and expand, our ideas and understanding around communication in that facet has to change as well. So, we see this particularly with what we call relational objectives. And relational objectives is this idea that we change the way that we communicate based on how we define and view the relationship. We see this with people like our grandmothers, which we'll talk about here in a minute. A boss or colleague. You're going to talk differently to your boss, than you might talk to someone that you just work with. You're probably going to talk a little bit differently to your friend versus someone who may be your partner or your spouse. You're also going to talk probably a little bit differently to your parents than you will to your teachers, although you'll probably talk to both of those with a higher level of respect and professionalism than you would talk to your friends. You see this also with a pastor or spiritual leader or mentor. You're probably going to talk differently to them than you would talk to anyone else, because the way we communicate changes based off of how we define and view our relationships. Our grandmother's a perfect example. If I go home for Thanksgiving and I go in and I say, "Hey grandmother," hey grandma, I wouldn't call her grandmother, say, "Hey grandma, how are you?" She'd be like, "Oh, how are you, sweetie?" I'd be like, "Oh gosh, I got lit as AF, right? Yeah. I got so lit last night. Where's the turkey? I've got such a bad hangover." She would slap me into next year, right? Because you don't talk to your grandmother that way, right? That communication, the communication with that relationship is different than if you were to say that with your friends who wouldn't think anything about it. You say, "Oh, I got so lit." Right? They wouldn't think anything about it. So those relationships change based off of how we define and view the relationship. Unless you're this grandmother, I suggest you follow her on Instagram. I love this. She has a lot of followers. She posts a lot of crazy pictures. She's 87 years old. This was something, she's Batty Winkle, if you want to follow her on Instagram. And then this is probably my favorite picture that she posted here. Right? So sometimes we break those stereotypes, we break those norms of how we should communicate based off the relationship, but for the most part, they hold pretty true. Now, the book defines communication as a process, and if we go back to the basics of communication, it essentially starts with this idea that there is a sender and a receiver of a message, right? So there's a source for a message, and then there's someone who's going to listen or receive that message. They put that message out there, and that message is transmitted via a channel. So is it face-to-face? Is it via audio, which is what we're doing now? So what is that channel? Is it a newspaper? Is it television? Is it face-to-face? Is it radio? Is it audio? Right? So a sender sends a message through a channel to a receiver. Those receivers then provide feedback. That may be audible feedback, or they may nod their heads in agreement, or they may raise their hand and suggest that they don't understand something in a traditional classroom setting as the one that you see pictured here. Right? That's a very outdated model of communication. In its basic form, it is correct, but we have now shifted to what we call a social communication model. And the social communication model, as demonstrated here, shows what's wrong with the old model of communication. When you communicate with someone, it's not just thoughts being transmitted between you and them, which is demonstrated in this photo. In reality, it looks more like this. There's all of this other stuff going on. There's all of this noise. There's all of these other thoughts. There's all of these other components, all of these other elements of feedback that come into play. One of the things that we can identify within a social communication model is what we call field of experiences, which says, I am who I am today because of everything that has happened to me up until this very point and moment in my life. So if someone comes to me and says, as in this photo, you can see that they're clearly having some sort of argument, I would automatically think something bad has happened, right? Something bad has happened, right? What are they saying? So the context here matters, because everything that has happened into their relationship up until this point in time, this very conversation, is shaping the way that both he and she is perceiving that conversation to be going, right? Maybe he cheated. Maybe he cheated in the past, and she's just seen some shady text messages on his cell phone, right? And so she's using the field of experiences, the sum of everything that's happened to her up to this point in time in her life, to help her make sense of what this means. So the social communication model takes that original form of communication and it says there's a lot of other things at play here. There's previous experiences, there's life experiences, there's noise, there's technology, there's all of these other things that impact the way that we can communicate. In its basic form, that is communication. Why we communicate, what communication is and why we communicate. Now, specifically, as we look forward and examine public speaking for this class, public speaking is defined as a process of presenting a message to an audience, whether that audience is small or large. Now, there's a few elements of public speaking that separate it from just normal conversation. One is that you have to be more prepared than just regular conversation, right? So there may be times when you're asked to speak on the spur of the moment, but you're going to usually know in advance if you're going to be expected to give a talk about a specific occasion. So a public speaker, they may spend hours, they may spend days, they may spend weeks preparing, if it's a really big speaking engagement, practicing his or her speech, right? So you have to be more prepared than just normal conversation where you may bump into someone on the street that you haven't seen in a while and you strike up a conversation. The second element of public speaking is that it is more formal than conversation. And that just means that generally the slang that we use, the casual language that we speak with to our friends is not generally the type of language that we're going to use in public speaking. So for this specifically, audience matters. And we're going to talk about audience in the coming days. But who is your audience? Is your audience a group of college students your age? Then yeah, you can probably use more casual language and some slang, and that's going to be okay. But if you're speaking professionally, you definitely want that conversation to be more formal than casual. So that's the second element. The third element is that public speaking requires clearly defined roles for the speaker and the audience. Now, those roles generally remain stable unless the speaker asks or elicits an audience interaction. So what we mean by that is, if you go to a speaking event and you know someone is going to be speaking, generally we're going to remain quiet. We're going to be quiet, we're going to listen, we're going to take notes, we're going to provide eye contact. We are not going to interrupt that speaker unless that speaker asks us for interaction. Maybe they say, by show of hands, raise your hand if you've ever, or has anyone ever experienced this, or would someone like to share their experience? So unless the speaker elicits the interaction from the audience, from us, we have very clear, very stable, defined roles. So those are the three elements that define public speaking, right? It's more prepared than just regular conversation. It's generally more formal, and it does require clearly defined roles for both speaker and audience. So why do we study public speaking, right? The first benefit of studying public speaking is empowerment. Empowerment is that you're going to gain confidence and skills in communicating with others. People who feel empowered are generally people who feel like they have the whole world in their hands, that nothing can hold them back. It's this yes, you can mentality, right? So if you are a good, confident public speaker, you're probably going to feel more empowered. You're going to feel like you are able to be more successful with people around you, both personally and professionally. And that's one of the key goals for this class, is to help you become a more confident, more comfortable, a more empowered public speaker, because it can make huge differences in your life, both personally and professionally. People who are good public speakers experience much better opportunities in those areas. They're more empowered. And the second main benefit of public speaking, practicing and becoming a better public speaker, is employment. You will enhance your career and your leadership opportunities. Employers constantly say, when asked by recruiters what skill sets they're looking for in new hires, in recent college graduates, and they say time and time again, they want people who are good communicators, both good written communicators and both good oral communicators. It matters. If you are a good communicator. You are going to enhance your career and your leadership opportunities. So if you don't want to become a better public speaker to see improvements in your personal life, that's okay. If you don't want to become a better public speaker to become more empowered, to empower yourself and others around you, that's okay. But maybe you just want to become a better public speaker because you want to make a little extra money and you want to be successful. That is important. And that matters too. If all else, do it for the dollar bills, y'all. That concludes our first lecture on what is communication, why it is that we study communication, what public speaking is, and some of the benefits of public speaking. We'll see you next time.